Hey, YouTubers, do you want to know what AWS is? And do you want to know why companies use it so much? Then keep listening in. If you are a college student, fresh into IT, or you're just interested in tech and you don't know what AWS is, listen right now because I am a cloud architect and I'm going to break it down for you. All right, let's start with number one. What is AWS? AWS is Amazon Web Services. That, in very simple terms, it's just a name that they came up with and essentially describes what it is. So AWS is a place where you can buy infrastructure for your company. What that means is that you can buy virtual machines or virtual servers. You can buy a place to put code in the cloud. You can buy a place to put content in the cloud. You can buy a place to put your distributions of content in the cloud, slightly different. There are a whole bunch of different services that AWS offers to companies, and the reason that they have become so popular is due to their ability to do three different things. Number one is scalability. Traditional architectures, such as like having servers in a data center, right? That requires a large amount of upfront capital. You have to provide the servers. You have to provide the monthly payment for the space to put the servers. Now, with AWS, you don't have to buy any of those servers. So AWS is structured usually most things. I'll start with the server side, which is EC2. That is going to be it's based on an hourly basis. So you can choose the different size of the virtual machine that you want. It can go all the way from a little bitty tiny virtual machine all the way up to the most powerful machine that you could imagine, right, to run one application if you really wanted to. And of course, the pricing scales up and down based on that too. So it's enticing for companies because I don't have to front all this money for a server. And then if you're using like a virtualization software, which most companies did use it, before AWS, and a lot of them still use it today, such as VMware, and there's a couple others out there too. Instead of using software like that, which is very expensive as well, all of it's taken care of for you in AWS and even backups, right? That's a whole separate topic that we'll talk about in a different episode. So scalability really is AWS's biggest advantage in that I say I need to add another virtual machine, right? And my business is growing and I want to build out a new application, okay? In a traditional model, say that you're at capacity, right? I'm at capacity and these servers are, say, $25,000, $30,000 a piece, plus you have to have someone go install them, you got to get them all hooked up, set up, which, depending on how big your team is, can be a really big hassle. So what AWS will offer instead is that instead of having to buy another piece of hardware, I literally just go add another virtual machine. And then my cost is just incremented by however much that virtual machine costs after an hour of running. And then hour by hour, it accrues that, and you're billed on a monthly basis. So the scalability part, and also from a teardown too, let's say a business is not doing well, then you can just literally, if you don't need the size of the servers that you once needed, or you don't need, you don't have the same traffic flowing through, you're not running, you optimize something or de-optimize something, then you can obviously scale down too, and you can reduce that cost right then and there, and it immediately starts affecting your bottom line compared to you just spent all of that money on those servers. So whether you succeed or fail, you've spent that capital and there's no going back. So scalability, very, very important in AWS. The next piece of it is a little bit of a misnomer, I would say, but I would say that security is probably number two. AWS allows the ability for someone who has minimal skills in securing say a network or a application, you can secure your applications in the cloud and your services in the cloud pretty darn easily. There's it's part of AWS, but it's called a VPC, a virtual private cloud. And that allows you to really control everything inside of your own little sphere of AWS, of what's going in, what's going out, what different servers can talk to, what different services can talk to, what different containers can talk to. You can define all of that. And they also have their own user-based roles and everything else. So the security aspect around AWS is really, really good. I do give my hats off to them for that. and I won't go into that much further. The only argument I guess that could be made is like, if someone breaks into an AWS account, and if you don't have MFA enabled, then yeah, it can be a really, really bad, right? Because it's the same console login essentially for every AWS site, unless probably if you're government, they probably have a separate one. But for any AWS customer, it's the same login. So obviously you're pretty exposed if you're not using MFA and you're not, making sure that everything's locked down. So now we're going to get into the third topic of AWS, which is that I really consider to be the, one of the pillars of why people and companies go to AWS, and that is reliability. So when we talk about what the traditional, the old school architecture of how companies deployed things, we had a data center, right? And those servers were bought. Well, what happens to those servers when a hard drive fails, right? Even if, for all you tech people out there, even if you're set up in RAID, right, you still have to send someone out there to go replace that hard drive. And then you have to, discard the old hard drive, which again, there you go. I mean, hard drives are cheap, but they're not, the cost adds up. So you have failed hard drives, you have failed components, you have failed servers, even if you have high availability, everything else, you're still having to manually go and replace and repair your own hardware, right? With AWS, there isn't any of that. It runs. It just runs. And it just runs because they don't allow you to do any of that. You don't have control over the servers. You don't have control over any of the backend processes. You literally just stand up your own virtual machines and bang, you're done. And of course, there's plenty of other services. I'm just focusing on EC2 stuff right now. So compared to a traditional environment, when we talk about, the reliability, AWS has their own teams. They have their own, data centers, and they are controlling all of that. And of course, they make enough to actively control that and make sure that everything's reliable. So whether you're a company of 5 people or 5,000 people, you're getting the same level of treatment as far as making sure that those servers are online, compared to if you're a traditional company and you're using traditional hardware of 5 people. What if all 5 of you are not available and the server goes down? Well, that website, that application that's running things, that is down until someone gets up to the physical place that it is and fixes it. If you can't get to it. Whereas at AWS, that's not a worry. So it shifts kind of the way that IT teams are built, right? I don't need someone who necessarily knows how to build servers anymore. I don't need someone that knows how to necessarily, get into that whole side of thing. Like, you don't need to know SIMC. You don't need to know all of the backend stuff on, hosts anymore. Even VMware, right? If you're an AWS shop, you don't need someone that necessarily knows VMware. So really, really beneficial in all of those fronts. Now, I am going to cover 1 or 2 caveats here to AWS. And the first one that I, as a software developer, always hate when a company is only using AWS is your development servers are, once you go to AWS, you're paying for those as well. In a traditional, like, old school model, okay, you usually would take your old production servers and then those would become your development servers. So basically you're getting your development environment, not necessarily for free, but you're getting it at a severe, right, depreciated discount compared to, because you already paid for them. So you're a steep discount, right? With AWS, there's no real sandbox. Like if you're getting training, there's a sandbox, but once you are in AWS in a production environment, you can create development servers, but you're still going to be paying the same price for them. The other problem that I see with AWS is that, it's the flip side of the security, right? So, which we talked about, but I'll go into it a little bit more. If you have someone who's inexperienced, then I mean, like, they just either don't know what they're doing or they don't care what they're doing, and you let them run loose in your AWS environment and start, opening up access, right? The most common situation that I always see for a security breach is because someone decided, because they couldn't figure out how to point AWS to a correct IP schema, a correct subnet, or they couldn't figure out the correct, like, CORS headers for their API function. So they just wide open it. Completely leave it wide open to any IP address on the servers and to any cross subdomain for, like, CORS, right? So that right there is a huge problem Because again, we're not talking about like I'm allowing access inside of a network, right? These servers have access like, oh my gosh, every employee has access to these servers. That's bad enough. No, every single person in the world can have access to these servers. And you can say, well, most of them are secured, with RSA keys. That's assuming that you opened up SSH. If you just opened up 80 on an unencrypted port, then you're exposing yourself to attacks that would probably not be there if you were somewhere isolated inside, right? Not to say, again, that those same things don't happen in a traditional architecture, but the fact that if you're building a team out in AWS and they're new at it, then you can run into a lot of those errors. So my advice for companies that are wanting to go to AWS, lift up, or in the case that like I always propose is a hybrid environment, and do a site-to-site VPN between your existing hardware, and then you just start slowly building out your new hardware, and you can do a nice transition. My advice is hire a consultancy agency, definitely. There are a ton of good ones out there. AWS actually has a list of preferred ones too that they can provide. That can help you specifically with your needs and your uplift or your transition, maybe from Google Cloud or Azure to AWS. There's a lot of resources out there as far as like companies go that can help you really effectively plan it out. The other thing that I will recommend is budget. So AWS is good. This actually goes into a third bad thing about AWS, but AWS is good for a lot of different applications. Streaming heavy data requires a very tailored, I would say, service architecture in AWS. You can rack up a ton of money, and I mean a ton of money in a very short amount of time. I'll give you an example. When I was building out a software application for a NFL team, and they needed it at their headquarters, I built out this software package that basically they requested a video in the background, right? So most web pages would cache that. I was like, not a big deal. It'll be a small, it's like a 20, 30 meg video. It'll transfer over once, it'll cache, whatever, it's fine. It's going on like 40 TVs. We're building this TV display web app. Super simple, not a big deal. So we're building this out. I build it out. I deploy it. I go on vacation, right? Get it all set up, go on vacation. Well, I come back and our AWS bill has literally tripled in 4 days. In 4 days, it went from $2,000 to $6,000. And at the time, again, really small presence in AWS. So that is a huge deal. The reason is that the videos were not being cached on these specific media players. And it ended up just repeating the video and just constantly pulling the video down from the cloud times 40 every like 10 seconds. It's just pulling down. It was the biggest life lesson I ever had to learn about AWS, because the data costs are something that you always have to calculate and you always have to have a measure on when you're doing something that is very data intensive and you're transferring a lot of information in and out. You really need to have, if you can't hire a consultancy, then you need to do some small tests just to see and take that risk of how much it's going to cost, because that is one upside to a data center, right? You're paying for the hardware, but if you're transferring terabytes of data every month in and out, then you might actually be saving money by having it in a colo rather than in the cloud. So food for thought on that, guys. Any questions or comments below that you guys have for me, leave it down below. And if you haven't yet, like and subscribe, please. Love you guys. I will talk to you next time.